Welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for August 6, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by John Hogoboom and Jim Clausing. I'm Brian Rexroad, and let's get right into it. We'll talk with John here first. And John, I guess, sometimes we see revolution, sometimes we see evolution. What's happening in the malware space today?
So we have an article today kind of about the evolution as opposed to revolution. Although sometimes, in these malware families, there's little small incremental revolutions that occur. We'll kind of talk about that a little bit in here. But in a nutshell, Krebs on Security, Brian Krebs put out an article within the past few weeks here about ZeuS and DNSChanger. ZeuS, we've talked about a lot in the past. It's a crimeware type of toolkit for theft of login IDs and passwords for mostly banking, but it's been extended to lots of other types of websites and whatnot. In any event, they've seen that there's a new version that's out called the KINS malware, and I think they actually say that might stand for something about Kaspersky Internet Non-Security or something like that is what that acronym may stand for, maybe some kind of dig at the Kaspersky antivirus vendor. In any event, when they took a look at this new sample, they had a hard time really trying to find a good sample of it, but it was being chatted about a lot on the forums, the underground Black Hat forums. And once they did kind of get a look at it, it doesn't look very revolutionary. But I do have a slide here that kind of talks about the evolution in general of ZeuS, which I thought might be interesting to people. So, in general here, ZeuS was pretty much, and some of these timelines are not perfect, naturally, depending on who identified it and whatnot. But for the most part, ZeuS kind of was first identified around July of 2007, but really didn't become widespread until around the March of 2009 time frame when it really started to ramp up. And then around, I guess this is September of 2010, a version 2 of ZeuS, which had a lot of new functionality in it, was released. And then in 2011, May of 2011, the source code for ZeuS was leaked. During that time, or in between this time, there were some other variants competing, SpyEye being one of them, which was another crimeware toolkit. A lot of people thought they might actually be related to the same family. Nobody's quite sure, but the author, I think, seems to think that they were competitors in the space. In any event, the source code was leaked, and it was kind of given away by the author to say, I'm done with this, and he went on to move on to other things, I suppose. In any event, after that source code was leaked, we saw a couple of things occur. Another version called the ZeuS Game Over variant emerged in the October 2011 time frame. This one integrated a peer-to-peer functionality in it for the command and control. So that's a little bit of a revolution in a small, incremental way. Not that we hadn't seen peer-to-peer type communication before, but this was, something new in the ZeuS crimeware family. So whoever got the source code made their own version that used peer-to-peer for the command and control. And then there was another version around January 2012 that came out called Citadel. This is, all of these are kind of derived from that original source code that was leaked. The Citadel variant added a lot of interesting functionality, like the ability to, take images off of the camera. If there's a web camera on the machine that it's infected, a VNC type of remote control capability of the machine that is compromised and whatnot. So it added some additional functionality. Citadel and Game Over are the probably two largest ZeuS variants out there now. There's probably still some other people running the stock source code in their own little pockets. But for the most part, these are the two largest groups, as far as we can tell, running ZeuS. So now there's this ZeuS KINS that's been identified. Right now, I don't think they've identified anything particularly revolutionary in this one, such as what the Game Over and Citadel variants have, added into it. But it's another one to keep an eye on. So, long story short, this is the evolution, and I guess when you look back here, this is a 6-year-old piece of malware that's evolved over time. People have been taking it and modifying it to their own means to keep it so it would evade antivirus and whatnot. Also, DNSChanger is another type of malware that also has recently reemerged onto the marketplace. So DNSChanger also emerged around 2007, and this was mostly a click fraud-related piece of malware in that it would try to direct infected machines to advertising websites so that they could generate click revenue, the pay-per-impression type of revenue that advertising offers when you can drive traffic towards an advertising website. And it was very pervasive. What it did is it actually changed your DNS settings on your machine and pointed your machine to rogue DNS servers that would give you different types of answers such that it would, not let you connect to your antivirus vendors for updates. DNS is real powerful, so if you can control a machine's DNS resolution, you can really trick it into doing all kinds of things, and the user might not even be aware of what's happening. You can redirect them to, their banking site will resolve to a rogue address. They won't necessarily be able to trick the SSL certificate, but they can make it look like in your browser that you're going to the right place even when you're not.
Right. Well, you can bypass the SSL security altogether.
Well, you could, right, yeah. If you're in there, if you have the malware on there to begin with. So so around the November 2011 timeframe, Department of Justice got involved with ISPs and other vendors. There was a big kind of partnership activity to try to take down the DNSChanger rogue DNS servers, get the malware cleaned up on people's machines. It was heavily pervasively installed on a lot of machines. I don't remember the exact count. Might be 4 million plus. It could even be more than that. I can't remember. That operation finalized around the July 9th, 2012 timeframe, and there were some arrests involved in that activity. Mm-hmm. So what we've seen recently, or what Brian Krebs has reported in his article, is that there's someone shopping around something called the Trend DNSChanger bot, which is a offshoot of the original DNSChanger malware. But instead of being click fraud related, it's ransomware related, so which is a little more troubling to me because before they were just using your machine to generate revenue for themselves, but now they're actually locking your PC so that the ransomware that gets put on the machine here locks it and it will pop up some kind of message on the screen that says, in order to unlock your machine, you need to purchase one of these prepaid types of cards. They mentioned MoneyPack, PaySafe, UCash, etc. And then there's like a PIN code in there that you would type in, and it would transfer money to that person or the attacker, and then they would unlock your machine. So a lot of times they do this as well, purporting to be law enforcement or something. They try to trick you into thinking that this is something that you're doing something wrong. They've detected that, and they want to scare you into paying them to unlock your machine. We're seeing more of this out there being distributed and infecting machines, so that's something to be aware of. But long story short, this is kind of an article about how there's not a whole lot of revolution going on here, but more evolution, reusing existing tools and crimeware kits, changing it a little bit, and the evolution of those as they become different versions along the way here. So again, this is another 6-year-old piece of malware. Again, one of the largest ones out there. In its heyday, it was one of the largest. ZeuS, certainly one of the largest as well, in terms of a malware family and the amount of infections it had.
All right. Now, if I remember correctly, a couple of things, just sort of some commentary here. Certainly the DNSChanger things, we've seen a number of botnets in the past that redirect DNS. In fact, in some cases, they sort of take the cheap route, they change the host file, and will redirect specific domains to predetermined IP addresses as a part of the malware infection itself. So that concept actually, I think, predates 2007 timeframe. The thing that was significant about the DNSChanger that you were reporting about here is that it was a significant footprint of infected users that hid for a significant amount of time. As you see here, it was 4 years between the time that it was known to have established itself and before actually any significant action had been taken to actually, create a deterrent, including the arrests associated with people. And they seized like $14 million in assets as a part of that arrest activity. So I merely wanted to point out that DNSChanger is, changing how the DNS points and changing where the host points to for DNS actually is much more pervasive than this particular example that you were talking about here. And I believe that DNSChanger was also associated with fake antivirus. I don't want to, promulgate any misinformation, but I believe that was true. I'd have to double check the notes on it. But the significance is in this trend DNSChanger bot that you were talking about. Basically, what they're doing is, holding the machine ransom, basically compelling you to pay it, as opposed to trying to fake you into buying something that you don't really need.
Right.
Yeah. So that's an interesting story. Now, do I understand correctly? You talked about the DNSChanger here. Is that a part of this KINS thing, or is that an independent?
Two separate things, but both kind of reemerging on the crimeware marketplace, I guess, is kind of the message here, is that people are kind of repurposing old tools, trying to kind of spruce them up a bit and put them back there on the market for sale, for people to buy and use in their own activities, criminal activities.
So the old concepts that have been successful or certainly haven't gone away. It requires a consistent and persistent set of deterrents that to keep them at bay.
Right. Exactly. Stuff that has worked in the past, they'll just make minor tweaks on it and keep on using it because it still seems to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that type of thing in the advanced persistent threat space as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so let's talk about, I guess, a mildly, but maybe a sort of a hardware analogy to some of this that we just talked about. I guess sometimes keyboards don't really look like keyboards. Is that right, Jim?
Yeah, well, this was, I came across this article on the Webroot blog last week by Danko Dankev, and it was an interesting idea that I had heard some murmurs about sometime in the past. And we've talked in the past about, USB keys and AutoRuns and how AutoRuns should be turned off. And, the Microsoft made the change so that it was not on by default for USB stuff some time ago. But it turns out that there are ways around that, and recently one of the ways that's been used to kind of get around that is by identifying, having the USB device identify itself to the OS as something other than a mass storage device.
Right.
So if it identifies itself to the OS, in this case as a keyboard or some sort of input device, then it can run the script or scripts. Anyway, it's not the AutoRuns, but there got some programming in there to get it to execute scripts for you, and these are being marketed. They're being marketed to the bad guys. So they're also being marketed to penetration testers, to legitimate security folks. Because if the bad guys can use them, they're useful to us too. And the big thing that really brings back to mind is the aspect of physical security. If you can get access, to the system, physical access to the system, there's a lot of stuff that you can do. So it was just an interesting twist that I hadn't seen being used a lot. Like I said, I had heard some murmurings about it some time ago, and then frankly had forgotten about it until I saw this one, where there actually are marketing now these USB sticks that identify themselves to the OS as, as keyboards or mice or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I think you've got, this is, I guess, in my opinion, some good reinforcement here. That is the fundamental concept. On one hand, you want to try to think about this as some sort of a bug in the operating system. But even in the basic premise of a trusted computing base, the notion of physical security around the platform that you're trusting is a necessity. And that's always been sort of built in, way back to the Orange Book days. The physical security of the platform is part of what is presumed or actually expected, specified as a requirement as a part of that security environment. And, even for, a desktop computer, the presumption is you're not pulling the screws out and installing things. Now, when the original trusted computing-based notion was created, they weren't really thinking about, plug-and-play type devices. And that is actually a little bit of a twist in the sense that, even a mass storage device, a keyboard here, or a mouse, or even more sophisticated plug-in devices, they actually are computers in themselves, a very small one in that sense, but they're computers in themselves. They have to develop an interface with the device they're plugging into. And by that, by virtue of those capabilities, they're, as you said, scripts that can be run to be able to help configure things and establish their communications parameters. And this is, I think, just a reinforcement of the fact that you have to have security around devices. And, lo and behold, here we have, laptops running around. They're getting smaller and smaller, very mild distinction between mobile devices and, desktop devices in the sense of how they interact with things and the computing and activities. Very good story in the sense that there's a lot behind this that we need to think about in terms of protecting systems. It's not just this particular example.
Right, and the other thing with your bring your own device situations, people bringing in their own tablets or mobile phones or whatever, and then plugging them into the laptops or the desktops to sync with sync calendars, sync music, sync documents, whatever. Those are full-fledged computing devices. We've talked a couple of times about we talked a couple months ago about some malware on an Android device that actually infected a Windows device if you plugged it in to sync it up. This brings back to mind those kinds of things as well. As you just said, you get full-fledged computing devices here that you're plugging in, and now they can conceivably attack other computing devices.
Right. All right, very good. That was a very thought-provoking, even though it was relatively simple in concept, clever from the attacker's point of view, but thought-provoking, at least from my point of view, and hopefully for others as well. And, I guess it's probably good to bring some good news occasionally. What can you tell us about the password space here?
Yeah, this story I came across last Friday or something like that. There was another password security breach. This time it was Opscode.com. That's not particularly important, but their open source side, they had some passwords breached, but what I took as a positive sign out of this, and the only reason I really brought it up, because otherwise it's just another password breach story. But in the past, when I've talked about these things, we've talked about doing something other than just MD5 or SHA-1 to hash, something more computationally expensive for the attacker. The good news was, in this case, in fact, they were using PBKDF2, which is one of the stronger password hashes, one of the ones actually that we had talked about on this program over a year ago when we had the big LinkedIn password breach thing. So I thought it was good news that some folks are taking those additional steps, doing something beyond just MD5 or SHA-1 for storing the password hashes. The underlying thing, we're never going to be able to create perfectly secure software. Any reasonably complex piece of software, there are going to be bugs in it, and that's what happened here. There were some bugs and some of the developers have now helped them fix this up. As of, I think, yesterday afternoon or early this morning, the two sites that had been compromised are back on the air, and they've patched the hole that they used to get in. But so we're never going to be able to make perfectly secure software. But the good news here is that these guys took seriously some of the things that we've been saying in the community, have been saying about the need for stronger protection. And so they were using this hashing algorithm that makes the job of brute forcing by the attacker more computationally expensive, more difficult. So I thought that was good news, and that's the only reason I really wanted to bring this one up here, is to say it looks like some people are taking the steps that we'd like to see more people take.
All right. So if I understand correctly, so long as users have created sufficiently complex passwords for that site, it would make it much more difficult to go through a brute force attack process because they have to do so much computation to generate each guess. Is that a correct interpretation? Exactly.
The hash algorithm here is more computationally expensive for the attacker to try to brute force.
So I guess with a few conditions like making sure that you have a sufficiently complex password, or at least a sufficiently hard to guess password. Just complexity and hard to guess aren't necessarily the same thing, but that would at least buy some time, so that you can, in this case, have identified that the penetration had occurred, that the information had been stolen, notify the users, give them an opportunity to change their password after the site's been restored, so that presumably few or none of the actual accounts have been compromised. And if I understand correctly, I read, I was just actually reading up on it as you were talking about it here. This algorithm apparently has some adjustable number of iterations that you can put through the processing through to help actually increase the computational expense of guessing the passwords. Do you happen to know if how many have been used in this case?
I have not seen them say what they set that parameter to, but the basic point was you make it more computationally expensive for the attackers. That gives the users more time, to change your password, as you said. And so of course they have recommended. Well, they did reset all the passwords on the system before they brought it back online. And obviously, we say this all the time, you shouldn't be using the same password on multiple systems, and blah, 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 blah. But yeah, as I said, I really brought this one up because I thought it was good news that folks are starting to take this step to use something stronger to hash the passwords.
All right, so perhaps I should have introduced this as a silver lining on a gray cloud.
Yeah.
All right, thanks very much, Jim. Let's take a look at the internet weather for the week here, and I'm going to describe this as a fairly mundane week, relatively speaking, but there are a couple of unique things. I think that's a common theme that I wanted to share with you. First of all, we've talked about this one before. This is port 5038 TCP. We see scam probe activity on this. It's somewhat sporadic. And actually, sporadic is an indicator. That is, if you were to see a relatively stable set of scanning activity, it would be perhaps an indication of lots of organizations or lots of actors that are, probing for this activity. The fact that we're seeing it as fairly sporadic is an indicator that it's perhaps one group or a few that are doing it. And in this particular case, it's actually just a few source IP addresses from China that we see doing this probing activity. And the most prominent we saw right around I guess, July 30th. It is more significant than we've seen over the last 60 days. I'm showing 60 days worth of data here just to give you a little bit of an idea of what's been going on. And like I said, we've reported on this type of activity before. But you can see, like, let's see, I think this was August 3rd here. It basically turned off. Most of the activity had effectively disappeared. And then it came back on the 4th, yesterday. So actually the day before yesterday from generating this report here. So in any case, there is some interest in scanning for these basically software PBXs effectively. And it's interesting to note that the same sources that were doing this scanning activity were also doing scanning on, occasionally at least, on port 22 and port 3306 TCP. Now, 22 is SSH, and 3306 is Microsoft SQL database, both of which are sort of known to be targets for password guessing. I'm going to take a guess here and say that this targeting the asterisk voice over IP management interface is perhaps password guessing activity as well. And it may be not necessarily to get access to a voice over IP platform, but perhaps to actually get to the back-end system, the server that is hosting that, and possibly as a gateway into an enterprise. So you might expect, for example, an enterprise that's hosting, a software-based PBX, has an interface out to the internet to be able to gateway with other similar platforms, or perhaps provide voice over IP to other sites that they own. And if this site were compromised, possibly get access to an enterprise network for a maybe small, medium-sized business. That's my guess at what the motivation might be behind this. I think in the past we've kind of suggested that it might be associated with toll fraud, but this looks a little different to me. John, you usually have a comment about this, and I'm surprised you didn't today.
No. I think you're spot on with that one. It looks like it's probably some sort of password guessing, brute force type of thing. That would be my guess as well.
Okay. Next one here. This one is unique, different, and unusual. This is scam probes on port 18186 TCP. This is actually registered in IANA Numbers Authority as Occupational Health SC. And I believe that might be associated with a company. I don't have any idea what the application might be, although I'm going to guess it has something to do with health. But in any case, the activity appears to be originating from a small botnet. I saw on the order of maybe 50 or so sources at any given time. There may be, in fact, many more that are associated with this botnet. I didn't do a lot of in-depth analysis on it. But the significance here is that the participants are fairly consistent over time. And the scanning activity appears to be coordinated. That is, they are acting together and have similar characteristics. Most of the probes are coming from Hong Kong, China, and to a lesser extent, United States. So there are United States, based participation in terms of servers, and it appears to be, at least in the U.S. ones, web servers that are participating in it. So, hosted servers, not sort of consumers that might have been compromised, for example. With that, we're seeing, somewhat spurious activity that might be associated with the address blocks that they're scanning at any given time. But it has been fairly consistently taking place since about August 1st here. Next item here is one that I think we talked about last week. This is scan probes on port 1521 TCP. That's the Oracle SQL interface. And I think last time when we talked about it, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, that you had mentioned that perhaps some of this activity might be inspired or motivated a little bit by the patch release cycle that Oracle had come out with. And so I decided to show 120 days here to illustrate that perhaps a little bit better. I don't know, do you have any comments on this, Jim?
Yeah, well, this actually does look like it might be related to the patch release, because the quarterly patch releases, one came out in late April and one came out in late July, and the scanning picked in early May, and the tail end of July, early August. So I still think it could be related to that.
Okay. Yeah, you might expect perhaps that, when a vulnerability announcement comes out or a patch announcement or something like that, people might want to go out and scan their systems or have a contractor go out and scan their systems and make sure that they're, up to appropriate patch levels. The thing that's specifically unusual about this is that most of these probes are not coming from somebody that you would associate as a security protection organization. Most of them are coming from, actually in this case, most of the probes are from China. There is actually a cloud or co-location provider in the United States that's also originating a lot of the probes, but the probes don't look like what you would typically expect for, security scanning activity. It looks like actually probing for open servers, that is, not probing lots of addresses as opposed to going after specific servers and checking for specific configurations. So, perhaps this is kind of motivated by some knowledge of potential vulnerabilities and looking for systems that could be compromised. Next item here is scam probes on port 808 TCP. And with a little bit of research, I wasn't actually familiar with this port, but it's apparently associated with Microsoft.NET TCP port sharing. It is, and I'm conjecturing a little bit here, but I think this is basically a service that helps you to use the same port numbers or other registered port numbers for applications, to avoid collisions, for example. So in this particular case, we see the majority of probes coming from a single address in China, and it's kind of interesting here. We also see scanning activity from these same sources on port 8088 TCP as well as 8080 TCP. So when I started looking at that, I thought, well, maybe it was a typo. They didn't type in the port number correctly, and they were perhaps looking for proxies and, SOX ports. But as it turns out, this has happened a number of times fairly consistently. So I'm thinking they really are looking for port 808 TCP here. This activity has been significantly more prominent since about August 2nd for a period of time each day. So there's a possibility that they are looking for this particular application. There may be some other thing that they're looking for as well. I don't know specifically.
Port 808, I believe, is also sometimes used on Microsoft Exchange servers.
Oh. Okay.
There's an article to that effect.
Yeah, okay. So that certainly could be a possibility. And in fact, there might be some relationship between the TCP port sharing. I'm not sure about that. But that would be a possibility as well. So in any case, a good idea would be to take a look at what's taking place on your network. If you see this activity on port 808, make sure it is legitimate activity. And I guess that's probably good advice for a lot of these other things is get an understanding of what type of activity you expect to see on your network so that, for example, when you get reports of this, you'll have some idea of whether it pertains to you. But on top of that, when you go to look at the activity, we'll have some idea whether it really belongs there or not. Next item here are our standard pie chart showing the top most probe ports. This is actually data from August 5th. And on the top of the list is port 445 TCP. Second on the list is port 53 UDP. We continue to see a lot of the DNS reflection attack activity, and that's most likely looking for servers to support that activity. Port 1433 TCP, this is a Microsoft SQL database, and I should correct myself, actually. I think I reported 3306 earlier as Microsoft SQL. That would be my SQL database. Next port that's on here, 3389 TCP. This is remote desktop protocol, and here's a relatively unusual one. We have talked about this one on occasion in the past. Port 19 UDP is showing up. That's the character generator service, which is a fairly unusual service to have turned on. It's probably a good indicator of a server that hasn't been protected properly. if it is turned on and accessible from the internet. But we have seen some indicators of of reflection attacks using character generator. Again, being a UDP port, it doesn't require an established connection. You can throw packets with a spoof source address, and the server that has this enabled will happily respond to that spoofed source address and result in an attack. Next one, 5900 TCP. This is help me out here, guys.
Virtual network computer.
Yeah, virtual network computing. Thank you. So that's, again, a remote access application, port 22 TCP SSH, and then port 80 TCP web. So those are the ports that are being basically probed, and we also see port 16464. That'd be, again, continuation of the peer-to-peer activity for Zero Access Botnet. And then in terms of the most sources doing the probing, port 445, a good portion of it here, roughly around 30% of the activity. And then we have, let's see, I guess the only other ones that are showing up that are significant from a security standpoint are port 80 TCP, so lots of sources digging for web servers, and then port 3389 TCP. And as usual, we see some of the peer-to-peer activity, specifically or predominantly for the Zero Access Botnet, and we also see a little bit associated with gaming activity. And with that, that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, please send us email. Our email address is threattrack@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available from the AT&T Tech channel. That's att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can also get a audio-only version of this program through iTunes. Just search for ThreatTraq. And thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Jim and John. I think this was, I very much appreciate your input to the program here. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.